hair. And I blame Laura for us having this month at all, because when she was here in August for the Moving Beyond Capitalism conference, she said, let me know if anything goes on with women or if you have something you want to put together. And from that germ, this month was created. And thank you all who have come to previous programs. Thank you, the committee and the volunteers in the audience, and thank you, Laura, for that idea. Laura travels around a lot. She's going to be in Portland, Maine for Easter weekend because she's speaking to a college there. She's just come back from Madrid. She has a big role in international women's issues. She's the director of the Americas program for the Center for Policy Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. And she's also other things that you won't read about. She's the advisor to the Nobel Peace Laureates who are women around the world. And she does more than I can even know about. But I don't want to spend too much time telling you about how wonderful Laura Carlsen is. I want her to bring her, what's the matter with me? I want to bring her to the stage, and let's welcome Laura Carlsen.
Well, I actually blame Trish and the rest of you for being here, and it's a great pleasure for organizing this whole event. And unfortunately, I couldn't be at a lot of the other events, but the program looks great, and it's just so wonderful to have this time to focus on some of these issues. So thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure to be with you and to be here in wonderful San Miguel de Allende. Ayotzinapa. Ayotzinapa has meant, for those of us who work on issues of the drug war, and particularly women, has meant a real sea change in the way we look at it and the way people talk about what's happening within Mexico today. And the reason boils down to the core slogan of the movement, mostly of young people, based on, of course, the disappearance of the 43 students in Iguala Guerrero, which is Fue el Estado. It was the state. With those three words, we changed and broke through this myth that the Mexican state has been fighting the drug cartels in order to win over organized crime within the country, and we began to see the situation for what it really is and what it really always has been, which is a mess of interests in which, more often than not, the state agents, the police, the armed forces, and the politicians themselves are operating in complicity and in collusion with members of organized crime for a series of both economic and political interests. And once you get beyond that good guys versus bad guys image of the war on drugs, and the idea that the government has still tried to sell when it talks about the case of Ayotzinapa, that what happened here with the municipal police of Iguala attacking and kidnapping and then disappearing the students later with the supposed involvement of the organized crime group is a case of a few bad apples, as the Attorney General has said, and you realize that it's far more systematic, then we know that what we're up against is really not just a problem of organized crime threatening society, but a society that has such serious problems of corruption and of an elite controlling interest at its core, that it requires not to strengthen the current state as it is in order to be able to defeat organized crime, but to take a really hard look at what's happening within both the society and especially within the state itself that has permitted this situation, and especially the violence, to grow so bad and so pervasive throughout the past years since the war on drug was launched. Now, we've talked before here in this space and in others about the war on drugs, so I want to go through just quickly what some of the major points are, and oftentimes some of the connections, especially with U.S. policy, that are ignored when we talk about the war on drugs. If indeed, with Ayotzinapa, the consensus that was already forming within Mexico society that this model of confronting the drug cartels and attempting to dismantle them and to seize cargoes of illicit drugs going to the United States, what is known as a war on drugs, and was a model initially imported from the United States, has been a total disaster. There's still a number of misconceptions regarding what's happened and what happens when this model is imposed in a country like Mexico, and particularly in the Mexican context. One of the first things that we see, of course, is that it's led to the massive militarization of society. The model was originated in 1971 by President Nixon. It essentially says that to enforce our prohibitionist laws in the United States, we're going to cut off supply to drug users, illicit drug users within the United States. The issue of demand is still present, and it's generally considered to be accompanied by programs to reduce demand, but that the idea is like, well, if they can't get the drugs, they won't consume the drugs. After 40 years of experience, more than 40 years now, with this model, we know that that supply-side approach doesn't work at all. You either have, first of all, they've never been able to cut off supply by these measures of trying to close borders, trying to go after the cartels, the production in the countries of origin, from fumigation of coca with its terrible impacts on the communities and on the environment in Colombia, to Mexico's border and trying to stop drugs there. They still haven't achieved it through that. And secondly, we know that it has these huge, enormous social costs to the people of the countries involved. Going beyond that, what we see after practically 45 years is that the question arises, if this model doesn't work from with the promotion of the United States, if the model has been such a tremendous failure, why is there this constant impetus to continue it within the U.S. government in particular, and this willingness on the part of a country like Mexico's? And of course now we're seeing, especially in Latin America, that a lot of countries are rejecting the model and are calling for major modifications to this prohibitionist enforcement model. But why would a country like Mexico be willing to do it? And that's where we begin to see that there are motivations behind the imposition of the drug war model and the militarization that accompanies it, that really don't have that much to do with a war on drugs. And there's a number of analysts in the United States, this has been becoming more and more clear, because with books like The New Jim Crow and some of the new documentaries that are coming out, tracing the history and tracing the impact of the enforcement model, what they've realized is that what this worked primarily for is as a mechanism of social control. Nixon develops the war on drugs in the early 70s when the society is divided. There are massive protests against the Vietnam War, especially students and young people. There's a civil rights movement of which he is no friend, as we well know. And there's a lot of division and rebellion within the country in this period. So when he develops a war on drugs, first you have an external model. And it's historically proven that if you want to unite a country behind strong and usually authoritarian leadership, the best way is to create a very threatening external enemy. So they took drugs, which is essentially a problem with the communities. People are using drugs for whatever reason. They maybe don't have employment options, or they feel like their future is not, challenging enough, whatever reasons. And also because people always use drugs throughout the history of humanity, and always will, at least part of the population. So they take this internal problem and they create it as an enemy. Drugs, an inanimate object, but somehow it turns into being public enemy number one, according to President Nixon. And he creates this whole series of federal agencies that are under his direct command, again, a way to concentrate power in the presidency, and then begins to throw young people in prison like never before. And we see, and then in the Reagan administration, that becomes intensified to the point that now, when the analysis comes out, after 4.5 decades, we see that the principal impact of the war on drugs has not been to defeat drugs, to defeat drug trafficking, or to improve the health and safety of the communities, but to incarcerate poor and especially Black and Latino youth all over the country. They're safely in jail, they can't protest, lack of jobs, they can't protest, lack of opportunities, they can't protest the changes and the repression that's going on in their community. Their families are decimated, they no longer become a threat to the system. And we see the same thing when we look at how the war on drugs was applied in Mexico in the year 2006 when President Calderon launches it. He's a weak president. He's got a serious problem of division within the country. There's 2 million people in the Zócalo calling his presidency illegitimate because of fraud. So the first thing he does, 5 days after taking office, is saying our biggest enemy is drugs and drug trafficking. He immediately has 50,000 army troops, 45,000 to begin with, in communities throughout Mexico. This is an on-the-spot repressive force for any type of social uprising which could have taken place at this point in Mexico's history when there was so much widespread discontent because of the elections. And it's continued to operate there that way to date, in particularly because with this presence of the army and with this role of the police forces, there's a possibility of also putting down local conflicts, and we've seen this happen in some places. And most of the local conflicts that they're looking to control, assuming, again, that the war on drugs, what it really is a mechanism of social control, have to do with control of resources. So there's some people who say, to make the war on drugs okay, what we have to do is withdraw the army. And it's true we have to withdraw the army because there's really, almost every international human rights body will say armies should not be involved in domestic public safety tasks. And there's a law in the United States. Sometimes the line is blurred in the United States as it is here. Here it's almost completely against the law what's happening, and there's a lot of constitutionalist lawyers who will tell you that even if in some limited circumstances the army can be involved in something like that, there has to be a formal declaration of a state of emergency, which of course there hasn't been within Mexico. But apart from the army's involvement, and especially the Navy, because the United States government decided that the Navy was more trustworthy than the Army, because the Army has a more nationalist history, and there's a good part of the Army that's not so much in agreement of being involved, of having, you know, all of its forces practically turned over to this war on drugs. So with the armed forces there, the other thing that's happening is the militarization of the police. And of course, people like all of you, I'm sure, who've been watching politics in the United States know that this again is part of the model that's being imported from the United States. We're seeing in the United States, and often also associated with drug war enforcement, we're seeing the militarization of the police. We're seeing SWAT teams going in, you know, to make a bust in cases that they've shot and killed 80-year-old grandmothers thinking that there's a drug dealer there. In the name of prohibition, which is basically a law that prevents people from a choice to consume drugs that are dangerous, you know. In the name of prohibition, we're seeing this militarization of the police in the United States. This has been very, very detrimental to Mexico, because when you take into the public safety enforcement an attitude of an army's attitude is, this is my enemy, I will wipe them out, right? So you take that into enforcement in your own communities against your own people, because even drug traffickers or the 14-year-old who's been hired, you know, paid $150 a week to be a lookout or something, I mean, they're still your own people. And they're not wearing a uniform, so it's not like you can tell that's the enemy, I'm going to shoot him. You know, so that's where we start seeing, with this logic, a very patriarchal logic in the extreme, might makes right, and force is the rule of the day. With this logic, that's when we begin to see especially the extrajudicial executions that we're seeing here in Mexico. And the Army has come out. There's a general who had an interview probably about 4 or 5 years ago and said, well, yeah, I mean, if we think this is a drug dealer, we're just going to go ahead and shoot him. Because we can't trust the justice system. We've tried to capture people and we put them in the justice system and they come up in front of some corrupt judge and they're let free, and what happens to all our work, and they get very indignant about this, and so they actually justify extrajudicial executions and just wiping out these people. There's a serious problem there that drug dealers or anyone who's been associated or considered associated with the illegal drug trade is like no longer a human being. Not only in terms of basic human rights and the right to a trial, for example, but in terms of the right to live. I mean, there's a strong mentality among a lot of these forces that they're just fine with going ahead and murdering these people as long as they can say later, and this happens even from politicians, and of course when President Calderon went to Ciudad Juarez after Villas de Salvarca, where 14 youth had been murdered, he said, oh, well, they were probably just associated with the drug trade. That's a dehumanization that we're seeing as part of this as well. When we look at the roots of the drug war and what's happened, this is what we see. It goes back not just to hear Calderon and Bush at the Merida meeting, where according to the official narrative, Calderon says, look, I'm ready to do this. We've got a huge problem with drug trafficking organizations. You guys are the market. You guys are the demand. You need to share responsibility and help us out with this. And President Bush, out of the goodness of his heart, says, okay, we'll help you out with it. That's not really exactly what happened. It goes back further, and it goes back to a very clear and explicit agenda on the part of the United States government, where they had decided, especially after beginning with NAFTA, they form, of course, a trade bloc, a trade and investment regional integration bloc with Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And then they begin to say, well, now we have a lot of investments in Mexico, we have a lot of trade with Mexico, a lot of economic interest there. We're going to extend this into a security bloc, which is, as far as I know, the first time that they've actually taken a trade investment bloc and made it into a security bloc, although that's definitely the direction in which the Trans-Pacific Alliance is going as well now. By doing this, and they were also explicit about this, the idea was not like we will all look out for each other's common interests. The idea was you two will look out for my interests. Mexico and Canada, there aren't too many threats from the north, I've said that before, but in Mexico they consider that there are, although actually that's another issue. We'll look out for the interests of the United States, which after 9/11 had become anti-terrorism and had become very aggressive in the sense that the Bush doctrine was saying, and now since we got attacked, we have the right to preemptive strikes, we have the right to unilateral actions. It was a doctrine that Latin America was really not at all comfortable with. But Mexico, by this point, with the degree of dependence that it had on the United States, was pretty much forced to go into this. This causes an explosion in violence, but I put this slide here because it's important to note that the violence predated NAFTA, and it predated, or especially predated, the war on drugs in 2006 as well. This is violence that goes back to, you could say it goes back to the dirty wars, and in fact the impunity of the dirty wars, when in the 70s the Mexican state was not held accountable for the murders of so many guerrilla members and activists, especially in the state of Guerrero. It's not a coincidence that we're seeing the problems come up today in the state of Guerrero, because it has this dual history of resistance and repression that go back decades. And by never punishing, by never really going into what happened during those periods in the past, and especially the dirty wars, we created a stage for the impunity of the present and what's happening now. And the same can be said for the problem of femicides in Ciudad Juarez. We talk about the other Ayotzinapa. The issue of disappearances now has been calculated at some 26,000 people. And the issue of disappearances came up on the international level with the disappearances of young women in Ciudad Juarez. And the case is interesting to look back to because, first of all, it's important because they continue. And we'll see in a minute, not only continue, but rise. And also because the disappearances and the assassinations of young women as femicides, which means it's the murder of a woman because she's a woman. It's this very specific term legally, and that is to say that there's a gender focus. There's usually sexual violence and sexual motivations that have to do with the murder of these women. And it really showed us in a lot of ways the way that this globalization process under NAFTA, not just the expansion explicitly into the agreement that there would become a security bloc under the Security and Prosperity Agreement, but also just the dynamics of globalization, how it fomented violence, how it put especially women at greater risk, and how it created these mechanisms of control for the opposition, for dissidents, for rebels within the country, and for groups like women, indigenous people, campesinos. One of the main reasons for the violence within the drug war that we've seen, 100,000 people dead to date, is this strategy, which I'll just mention quickly, which is the kingpin strategy. It's still very closely adhered to and promoted by the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA in the United States, and the United States government in general, although it's riddled with criticisms and with holes by this time, because not only do they know that it doesn't work in terms of dismantling cartels sometimes, but they just change into other cartels and other organizations. But in terms of stopping the flow of illegal drugs to the United States market, and then especially, although this isn't even their objective, in terms of public safety. And in fact, completely the opposite happens. Every time there's a major drug lord taken out of a place like Acapulco in Mexico, there's an explosion of violence. And that becomes, the reason behind that is because there's a war of succession, basically. Another cartel comes in and says, this one, my rival has been weakened, I'm going to take over this territory. Or somebody else within the same ranks, there's a conflict about who's going to take over the leadership role in it, and it causes extreme violence, and yet they continue to apply this same strategy, and continue to say, look, we took out La Tuta now. You know, who really thinks that this is the end of the violence and the corruption and the drug trafficking in Michoacán? And we've already seen that it's not, even though it's been a short period of time, that there's smaller groups, those fragmented groups, which are the ones behind the Ayotzinapa case, Los Guerreros Unidos and Los Rojos. You know, those smaller fragmented groups are very frequently much more dangerous to civil society and much more violent than the larger cartels were in the first place. But they're less of a threat directly to the state. And that's where you see that really what's happening here, again, is a mechanism of social control that protects the state and the interests of the elite rather than the safety and the well-being of the population. So instead of a war on drugs, essentially what we're looking at is a war on us. In the United States, in Mexico, and everywhere else where it's really been applied. These are some of the effects. In Mexico, more than 100,000 deaths, 26,000 disappeared, a six-fold increase in torture, 300% increase in femicides in Ciudad Juarez, and at least 40% national. We have to redo the figures as well, but there's a tremendous rise. 160,000 displaced and about 1.5 million. The extrajudicial executions, the case of Tlatlaya and 22 youth who were killed by the army is the most recent, and a huge increase in reports of violations of human rights by security forces. We've been talking, about beyond capitalism in the first conference, and I want to carry a few of those themes into this one as well, because that context is so important to understand the drug war violence, and particularly also to understand this surge in violence against women that we're seeing. The economic system, this is contact in capitalism, and I'm not going to go in depth into all these issues, but it's clearly an economic system. It's a political system, and here we see the role of the state in protecting those economic interests, and how, especially evident in the case of Mexico, that state has evolved and basically deformed to be able to protect this ever smaller group of stronger and more powerful interests against a much larger population that is being increasingly robbed from and attacked in many aspects of their lives and their livelihoods. It's also a system of human relations. We've been talking a little about this because this is one of the sources in which you see the resistance of women so very clearly. This system of human relations under capitalism, where everything is quantified in monetary terms, where that becomes, the commodification becomes the way you relate not only to each other but also to the earth itself, and the way that patriarchy has been used to support that system has had a tremendous impact on women, and at the same time it's created this role for women, a natural role that many very brave women throughout the world have assumed to protect the values of life that capitalism is constantly attacking. And then the last point is this stage of predatory capitalism in which there's tremendous pressure on natural resources that are more and more scarce throughout the world. And as this pressure continues, again, we see in many cases women taking the lead to protect their homes, to protect their families, especially indigenous women, campesino women, and the rest of the community, of course, as well, not just women. We see this pressure on the poor and marginalized sectors to either disappear because they're not functional to the system, to give up their resources, or to be converted into exploited wage labor. And we see this increasing pressure on the earth and its resources, and of course on its very survival through climate change. In this context, what we're facing as women is in some ways a perfect storm. We certainly could be worse off. There certainly are places, especially on this planet, that are worse off, and we have to remember them in our own struggles as well, to be able to articulate those struggles whenever we can. But we are seeing a series of forces against that are extremely strong, and they tend to be fairly articulated among themselves, which is a problem that many times as grassroots organizations or as people who are defending another set of values in this context, we have problems sometimes getting together with other sectors and with other groups. But when we look at the enemy, in a sense, what we find is that they're doing a pretty good job of it, and that's very dangerous. And so this list is not in any particular order, but I think these are some of the major forces that we should take into account, especially as women, when we look at what we're up against. The first is this colonial neoliberal economic model that we mentioned before, and in the other conference on Beyond Capitalism, I mentioned it as a colonial neoliberal model of apparent democracy, as opposed to a colonial model, of course, that was directly imposed by military regimes, by an invading army in the conquest, of course, and where you had pretty explicit, this is what's happening, I'm winning, you're losing, deal with it kind of situation. But under apparent democracy, it's more difficult for us in the sense that there's a whole construct of, well, what are you complaining about? You got to vote last November, and this is what the majority decided, deal with it. And it goes hand in hand with this whole construct of monopoly media that very carefully tailor the messages that we're receiving to such a degree that in many cases, our own perception of our own reality is warped, especially our reality beyond the personal. And we find people becoming more and more oriented to the personal, because they can't deal with and they can't understand these other forces that are a little further out there, but that are having a very, very direct impact on their lives. This means that as activists, as people who really have an interest in changing things, we have to first break a lot of these myths that are being sold on a daily basis to people, and we have to shift the paradigms, and we have to, explain things in another way, and we have to find the spaces to do that. We've had, fortunately, the advantage of internet, so that now we don't have to rely on mainstream media to come ask us what we think, which they're never going to do, and we have other ways of getting the message out, but it's still an uphill battle. It's still always difficult to say, wait a minute, this isn't what's really going on there. And that's why it's so great to be able to talk to each other like this too, and to be able to discuss and then go out to talk to other people about new ways of thinking about what's happening and what needs to happen in our world on every level, from our family to our community, to our city, to our state, to our country, and the geopolitical level as well. We've talked about the war on drugs as a war on women, and sometimes people come up, in fact there's some people in Ciudad Juarez who are always making this argument and say, well, this war, women are probably less than 10% of the casualties. Because like any war, men are the combatants directly in the drug cartels, in the security forces, politicians, and that kind of thing. But there's a very specific gender aspect to it in a number of ways. First of all, certain women are targeted, and they're especially women who have taken on leadership roles in grassroots organizations, either in defense of the land or against, we'll see some of their struggles a little bit later on, or in search of the disappeared. If the majority of the assassinations and the disappeared are men, we've done statistics for the Movement for Peace with Justice and Democracy, and the majority by far of the people who are putting their own safety and security on the line to look for those people and to get justice in their cases, to look for their disappeared sons and daughters, to call for somebody to at least be investigated and tried and punished for the outright assassination of their loved ones. They're over 70% women. It's women who are at the forefront of those movements, and those movements are not only for their children, but for the entire society, to begin to crack this system of impunity and demand that somebody do something is a direct challenge to the system. And of course the system knows that and responds, and there have been some women who have been assassinated, and men as well, in the process of that. And that's another way in which women are playing a major role in this. And then there's a use of women's bodies to send messages. What we've seen in the drug war too, that didn't used to be true. It used to be that the drugs came up, they were some produced here, and then there was a transit of cocaine from the Andean region that came up through Mexico. Now there's methamphetamines as well that are mostly produced within Mexico. And it used to be that as long as those trafficking routes were clear, through agreements with politicians, not just in Mexico, because they have to pass into the United States as well. So as long as that corrupt, complicit system was functioning, there wasn't a lot of impact on civil society in terms of violence and that kind of thing. And what was most important was the business. It's still what's most important, but now with the war itself, it's become a war for territory. And we're seeing these really territorially based tactics. When the United States, talking about militarization, sends the Mexican armed forces, and I think police as well, up to Northcom in Colorado Springs, and begins to train them directly in tactics used in Iraq, what they're teaching them is territorial control. So this has been a change in what's happened. And in this context, women's bodies are considered part of the territory. That means that if a drug cartel or the army has control over a certain region, we said, especially see it with the cartels, there's what they call levantones por placer, where the cartel leader in that town will go to, in Durango, they were just telling me not too long ago, we'll go to the local high school and I want that one, and just pick up a girl and take her for a couple days as basically, a sexual slave. And if she's lucky, let her go after that time. And one father went to the police, and the police said, he's him. I can't do anything about that, you know. And they have used girlfriends or women who are associated with a rival cartel have been murdered and their bodies publicly displayed as a warning to the rival cartel, and we see a number of instances like this in which women's bodies become part of the territory. Another threat has been the rise in fundamentalisms. Many of you were talking to Las Libres, and that's basically what they're up against, you know, a rise in conservative, many times religious-based organizations and the power of the church within the government, and as a representative of a powerful elite to curtail women's rights in that context, something that we're seeing throughout the world as well. The rise in racism and xenophobia in Mexico is clearest with the case of migrants that are both coming through, and then the situation that Mexican migrants face within the United States. The rise of shadow powers, which are the cartels, and also the government, the part of the government that is functioning illegally, say. You know, the part of the government that is not doing what it's formally, visibly established to do, but instead engaging in a whole series of activities that are completely outside that public mandate. They can be considered, in that sense, a shadow power as well. And for women, the problem with shadow powers, and especially when the state is involved, is who do you appeal to? You know, when you are being attacked by an extremely powerful force over which there's no institutional control, we see this in the group of women human rights defenders. Ordinarily, to defend human rights, you know, you identify a case, you make a claim, a grievance to the official body. The official body is responsible for investigating it, and there's a process. And so there are women who are coming to the group and saying, we went to report this disappearance, or we went to report this attack, and walked in the office and were face to face with a person that we know to be either the aggressor or closely allied to the aggressor. Suddenly, instead of being in a situation where you are appealing to someone to defend your interests, you're in physical danger. And that's happening all over the country in a lot of circumstances, and has really changed the rules of the game. And of course, it's changed the kinds of strategies that we have to use to be able to confront this situation. And then finally, impunity, the lack of justice, the dysfunction of a justice system. 98% of cases are never punished. It's a wonder that we go on from day to day in even a workable society when I think about what that particular statistic means. And for women, the discrimination aspect of it means that the situation is even worse. It means that not only is there impunity, the likelihood that their case that they're bringing to the attention of the authorities will be solved is very low, which it is for the entire population, but there's this aspect of discrimination in which so many mothers have said in tears, and I went and I said, my daughter's disappeared. And of course they know that if you don't start looking for a disappeared person in the first 72 hours, I think it is, the chances that you'll ever find them alive are almost nil. And they said, and I went and I said, my daughter's disappeared, she didn't come home tonight. And they said, oh, she's probably involved in organized crime, or she probably just ran off with her boyfriend. And that's it, you know. So, and there's a lot of, so not taking women seriously. If they're indigenous women, they're even doubly discriminated. This becomes a additional factor to the problems within the justice and the policing system for cases that involve women. This, of course, is Ciudad Juarez again. And this is the Campo Algodonero, which is the cotton fields case, which is one of the few that received, not that exactly received justice, but it received quite a bit more than other cases because it actually went to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. So when we talk about this rise of 300% in femicides, and of course we ask ourselves, we see an overall rise in violence within the country. But what are the factors that are coming together here to lead to this so remarkable increase in femicides within the country? And not just, in fact, Ciudad Juarez is no longer the national leader. State of Mexico is worse. They're calling now for a gender alert in Baja California. A gender alert is when there's when organizations see that there's been a climbing rate of femicides and violence against women, they can ask the government for a gender alert that requires a certain number of special measures on the part of the government to stem this tide. And the government usually refuses. But it's a mechanism that social society organizations won within the country to at least call attention to what was happening. In Guanajuato, there's been calls for a gender alert. It's popping up in a lot more parts of the country as well. So we know it has to do with the war on drugs and the overall increase in violence. We know it has to do with the patriarchal system intensified, is what I put here, which means that when you have society in which, because of the drug war mentality, and the pervasiveness of drug cartels, which are extremely patriarchal in the sense that they have the classic features of being hierarchical, they are run by men almost exclusively, their code is I rule, and if you don't accept my word, I kill you, or I punish you, or I exert, my superior power over you, which is essentially the way that patriarchy is set up. So in that context of militarism and the narco culture, it also creates an environment in which women become victims more often. We have what we talked about in terms of the capitalist system and the impunity and the corruption, meaning that they have nowhere to turn when they are in a situation of violence or feel like they're facing threats of violence. We have the deterioration of the social pact, that is to say, the sense of community, the strong community that used to be a characteristic of Mexico in particular, that was able to keep people safe, that was able to come together to protect, has been broken down. It's been broken down by displacement under globalization. It's been broken down by the violence that we see in society. It's been broken down by military and police presence in communities. And that really makes women much more vulnerable as well. The normalization of violence, this attitude like, oh yeah, well they were killed because they were somehow associated with the drug trade, or well, yeah, we had another 20 assassinations in the city today, that's just a normal day, where people cease to be affected the way we should always be affected by these kinds of atrocities continuing around us every single day. As it becomes normalized, we lose our capacity to respond on a human level, on a political level, and in terms of action, indignation, saying no. And then the diversification of the drug trade that people have talked about, meaning that the drug traffickers, now that they're smaller, there's a more competitive environment thanks to the drug war, they begin to diversify into other trades, and we've seen this huge increase in sex trafficking throughout the region, and in kidnapping, extortion, human trafficking for labor, and other things that have made women and other people more vulnerable as well. When we talk about this convergence of threats against women, we also have to talk about the increasing role of women to protect in all kinds of movements, to protect their societies, to protect themselves, and also the way that women are, in a sense, called upon, or not just the role that we're playing, but the role that we need to be playing in this sense. And I think this is really, really important because of this analysis, wedding this analysis of patriarchy and the threats and the violence of patriarchy as a model that predates capitalism with what's happening in a capitalist society, we not only can have, as feminists, men and women, a deeper understanding of what's happening and of of how serious these threats are against us and how joined together in many ways they are. But we can also have a much deeper understanding of what needs to be done. So when we say that women have a key role to play and are playing a key role in resistance at this point in history, we're saying it not from an essentialist point of view. Well, women are naturally more moral or are naturally the protectors of life because of their biological functions. And there's been a lot of feminist critiques of that kind of an essentialist view of women's role, which kind of marginalizes them in a sense to those biological functions. No, we're saying it because of their historical and social roles and what we have to offer to a united grassroots struggle against what's happening to us today. Also because of women's role in the family, and the family, which has been correctly identified as a locus of women's oppression throughout history, is also turning out to be a unit of resistance in many parts of the world. And it's tricky to take that into account. You know, it's tricky to on the one hand, acknowledge the values, the human values that are embodied in the family, and how the protection of the family has become a direct challenge to capitalism in so many places. And at the other hand, acknowledge that within the family, there continue to be these structures of oppression of women. And that's when we begin to have deeper debates about changing families while at the same time preserving the beautiful things that make our lives so rich about them, and those things in which women are the principal caretakers, you know, the principal people who are involved in preserving and passing along many of those values. Also because of the reproduction of life, that role in protecting the children and having the children and making sure that they're able to grow up and have children in intergenerational survival, which does tend to fall again principally on women, has created a particular space, say, in which they become the defenders of life against a system of death. The role in as the glue of a community, not necessarily the leaders, but the ones who hold it together. We all know, you know, all the little things we do all the time to keep our communities together. And it's not that men don't do them either, but there's a lot of them that are very invisible in a lot of senses that we do as women in our day-to-day life. And that role is becoming essential in the challenge to capitalism as well. And the defense of land, territories, and place, that rootedness, this is my home, this is my life, this is my family, I'm not leaving, I'm not letting them take that away from me, has actually put women on the forefront of the local conflicts to defend natural resources from transnational corporations in particular. And it's actually been an inspiration to many men. They oftentimes it's the women who bring the men into the struggles because of this. So if women have become a target because of their activism, they've also become a source of hope and an essential part in the resistance. This, of course, is a picture of the Zapatistas. And the Zapatista communities are on the forefront and have been an example, of course, for many, many years in terms of the role of women. If you look at one accomplishment that is indisputable in the autonomous Zapatista communities, it would really be this changed role in terms of gender and the role of women. You know, if you look, it's hard, it's tough, not receiving any government benefits, to say that there have been significant material improvements or in the quality of living. And in other areas, it's been difficult, you know, in health and education, there's changes, there's goals, but arriving at them has been more difficult. But when you look at the role of women, you can see very substantive changes. And they have continued to be a source of inspiration to struggles all over the world. And that's the difference between these two kind of models of resistance, one in which, and this is really unusual in Mexico and throughout the world, in which people actually have kind of carved out an autonomous space, not wholly separate from capitalism because that's impossible, but an autonomous space in which they have the ability to begin to apply some of the values and the changes that they want to apply, and then the rest of us who are really more involved in confronting the tendencies that we see today. Women are on the forefront of the battles against corruption. This is por la dignidad, for dignity against corruption. And I think this is, that I took this in the elections in Honduras, against mega projects. You know, the mega projects are really are one of the biggest sources of displacement of communities. And this is the wind tower project in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec here in Mexico, where the women in the indigenous communities are really taking the lead in protecting their lands from transnational corporations that are putting up towers and without the consult of the communities. And that's been going on for a long time. There's been a lot of criminalization of the activists, there's been incarceration, and they continue to resist. And as you can see from this picture, many of them who are really doing that are women. And this is in search of their children, loved ones, and justice. This is a movement for peace with justice and dignity. They, these are two women who are, the woman on the right lost 4 sons, disappeared, and in two different incidents, and on the left lost her son, who was a federal policeman sent out to a community and was kidnapped along the way. Again, looking, where are they? You know, women in this fight against impunity, for the disappeared, for democracy and against militarization. This again is a photo from Honduras, not too long after the coup. One of the places where there was the clearest example of women organizing, there was a group called Feminists in Resistance, who from the beginning of the resistance to the coup and the protests for democracy said, we want democracy with women involved and we will defend it. For access to safe, healthy food. This, of course, Mexican corn, native corn. Against mines and in defense of land and territories. So right now the biggest threat is mines in many parts of the country and in other parts of Central America. Soon we'll find that it's oil extraction, oil and gas extraction. These women are in community in Guatemala, in northern Guatemala, and they're actually putting their bodies on the line to prevent the entry of heavy equipment of a mine in a community where they'd already had a local consultation. You know, the community had already decided that this mine was not to be built. And the government sent the police in, as you can see there, to open the way for the entry, the forced entry of the mine, and the women spent days, weeks, actually, in this protest and in this position to prevent that. For autonomy and new worlds, again, the Zapatistas, a new school, a new way of bringing up children. For life, it's a traditional partera. So the war and the violence, they have specific causes, which means that they can be solved. It's not something that we have to live with, this violence against women, this situation of war. It's a result, in large part, not just of the forces of evil dominating the forces of good, but of specific public policies that our own governments are carrying out that have led our societies to this point of crisis in so many different ways that we're seeing around here. And the problems themselves are transnational. We can see that very clearly, and you as a transnational community are close to that and can also and are always seeking out those linkages as well, as am I as an international analyst. There's a couple things that can be done. Putting an end to prohibition is one of them, because this whole market that they're fighting over, essentially, $38 billion, is a result of handing a business over to organized crime by making it illegal. An end to prohibition means that it comes out of the shadows It means that there's a chance to regulate, and it means that a huge chunk of income is denied by through legal sourcing, of especially marijuana that has lesser health impacts, by legal sourcing of what they're selling now. Others are to put a stop to the militarization. And there's just the idea now that drugs themselves, that there has to be this militarized response is so costly to society, and we need to tell our governments that we cannot support it, that we want their war industry cut off, and there's tremendous lobbying all the time. We go to Washington to talk about this. We don't come face to face with them, but we know who we're up against. We're up against Boeing, we're up against Lockheed, who are in those congressional offices practically on a daily basis, essentially saying, we need the drug war. We love the drug war, They don't say it like that, obviously, but that's the message that they're giving out all the time, and for very real reasons. It's a huge source of transferring public money to private defense companies, security firms like Blackwater, the intelligence companies now, the computer programmers and the software for the spying and all of that is a huge source of business too. Transnational problem, transnational solutions. We have to, in order to find those though, we have to reach across the borders. We have to reach across sectors. We have to give women their full place within the struggle. We have to encourage everybody to become involved. And we have to protect some of those people who are on the front lines right now, and especially women, who are paying the maximum price to keep up this struggle, to protect our own lives, and to protect our planet. Thanks. I have no idea how long I just talked, so sorry.
We have to be out of here by 10 till 1. We have 45 minutes.
Oh, that's good. That's about what
And we have a cordless mic here for people who want to raise questions. You be calling on people?
yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I was just, can you hear me? Just reading about a woman in Mexico City who's a journalist, and she was the one who exposed the $7 million palace, which the president or his wife was able to obtain. So she lost her job, and maybe you can talk about her a little bit. I don't know her name, but
Yeah.
she's quite well known in Mexico, and I wonder if there's any possible connection between her being a journalist and a woman, or this happens to journalists
Yeah.
all over
Yeah.
across the board.
Just now that I remembered that, I wanted to make a little plug here before we go in more into the question and answer part, and that is our program is pretty much unfunded. And so I think we're really doing a lot with very little right now. And so we have to depend, since we don't have a major foundation funding, of course we don't have any government funding, nor will we ever have any government funding. We have to depend on readers and the people who support what we're doing at the Americas program. So we're going to pass a hat, and anyone give please what you can. Checks to CIP Americas program are very welcome, and this will enable us. We have a group of writers. Most of them are not paid. Some of them who couldn't do their work otherwise receive an honorarium. They're throughout the continent. We have volunteer translators. We've got a great team that's doing their maximum to keep this going, but we have some kind of hard fixed expenses like our website, our distribution system, and we have people that need to have a livelihood for doing what they do as well. So please help us out to the degree that you can and that you want to, and it would be greatly appreciated. Now, Carmen Aristegui is probably the country's most well-known journalist. She has a 4-hour program in the mornings from 6 to 10, and she has a group of investigative reporters. There aren't a lot of investigative reporters, and there need to be in Mexico, and they have a great team. And they were the ones who brought out the corruption scandals against Peña Nieto now with the White House, the $7 million mansion that was owned by the contractor, and a number of others. They've cracked a lot of cases that caused major embarrassment and scandal to the administration. And what happened now is sort of on a pretext. They came out and they said, well, they fired 2 members of the team. 2 were the major investigative reporters on her team at MBS Radio. When they did that, she said, I'm not going to work without my team. You know, this is an attack on freedom of speech. It's clearly associated to the kind of work we do, which it undoubtedly is. It's not the first time they've felt pressure from the government because of what they do. And so she left too. And right now, they've refused to back down. And she's probably going to be able, hopefully going to be able to find, you know, a new place where her voice can be heard, because it's a very, very important voice. You know, I mean, I think it's significant. She's also, she's feminist and she's strong, she's outspoken. I think it's significant that she's a woman, whether or not, you know, it would have happened to a man as well. Of course, the 2 people that were first fired were men from the team, but either way you look at it, you know, it's a major blow to freedom of expression, to a strong woman's voice within the media, and to a voice that's one of the few voices that has a mainstream audience that's been critical of the government. So we'll be watching what happens from here on in and trying to support her as much as possible. But it's also a sign, an ominous sign of, among several, of an increasing attitude of repression within the government. Now that it has basically lost its positive international image, I think, you know, I think it's beginning to do a certain calculation saying, well, like, if people aren't going to like us anyway, here we go. That's what I'm afraid of, frankly. You know, it's like they had a certain, like, no, we want everyone to think we're the good guy and, you know, this handsome reforming president. But that kind of went up in smoke with Ayotzinapa, and they know that. And we're beginning to see more turning to outright repressive measures as a response from the Peña Nieto administration. I think this is one of them. Yes.
I'd just like to make a comment, an initial comment about femicide, especially in the development of capitalism, especially industrial capitalism. One way to lower the cost of production has been to use women or children, because you can pay them less for their labor. And one of the things that happens, I think, especially here in Mexico, embedded in the especially severe patriarchy that's held over from the colonial era with the help of the churches and so forth, is a resentment that men may not have jobs, especially with NAFTA. They're thrown off the land and so forth. And women are working in factories and other places and taking jobs that supposedly were reserved for men and probably working for a lot less. And this may be a contributing factor, embedded with all of the other things that you mentioned, to some of the femicide we've seen, especially in Ciudad Juarez, but of course it's increasing all over. So I wondered if you had any comment regarding.
Yeah, I think especially to the domestic violence, the increasing of these femicides are coming both from a rise in organized crime, attacks on women, in security force attacks on women too, and also in domestic violence, where men know they can get away with it. And I think in the domestic violence side, this was something that we looked at pretty closely more toward the beginning of the Ciudad Juarez, because it's very clear there, since the maquiladoras prefer female labor, because basically they say they can pay less. They don't say that, but it's more docile. They're less likely, because they're supporting a family and usually by themselves because of the unemployment of men. You know, they're less likely to protest working conditions, and they often say that they're just more nimble with in terms of fine motor coordination, although that's not really necessarily the case. You know, that was kind of the official explanation. But in that context, where you had more unemployed men and more women who were the heads of households in the sense of being the economic support, because of what that does to the classic understanding of patriarchy. It is frequent that men in an insecure situation will respond exerting control through violence and through physical abuse. So I think it is pretty clearly a factor, especially in places where you have a higher level of female employment than male employment. Yes?
Are any organizations like Amnesty, Equality Now, are there any organizations that are helping the situation?
Yeah, I think especially like Amnesty and the international human rights organizations, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the major contribution that they're making and that has been very important is just getting the information out, collecting the information. The government has its own way of presenting information, including statistics, and so some organizations have, research organizations like that, have played a watchdog role in analyzing and getting the best kind of numbers and data out on what the situation really is, although it's still always kind of a guessing game on a lot of this. And making visible the problems that are being faced and keeping pressure on the governments. In the case of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, some of the official, like United Nations organizations, it's been really important in Mexico because the Working Group on Extrajudicial Executions has called Mexico to task, and Mexico has signed almost every international human rights agreement there is, unlike the United States, and has constantly, and in fact a lot of countries consider it to be a champion of human rights. So when these organizations come and say there's torture, widespread torture in the country, there's widespread extrajudicial executions, there's all these problems, they're bringing forth a part of the reality that the government is constantly trying to hide. And it puts the United States government in a more awkward position too, although so far they haven't really cared enough to actually change their patterns of support for these security forces that have been documented to be violating human rights. But for example, in torture, the Amnesty International just recently came out with a new report that had this figure of the 6-fold increase. And in the Merida Initiative, which is a major support from, aid package from the United States to Mexico, supposedly one of the stipulations is that Mexico has to be addressing the issue of torture. And instead, since it began, the 6-fold increase is since the Merida Initiative began. That's what we're supporting. And yet, in the State Department, nobody is saying, oh, hey, we seem to be going in the complete opposite direction. Maybe we should do something differently. Because the real reasons that they're doing this don't have to do with what they say they are. Yeah?
I have a comment and a question, but first I wanted to thank you so very much for your most provocative and informative talk. That was wonderful. I've had a long history of being somewhat involved in Central America during the Contra War in Nicaragua and with an NGO for many years in El Salvador. And one of my big concerns back just at the turn of the century, the millennium, was the building of one of the largest police military schools in San Salvador, which was, according to a lot of people, Condoleezza Rice's and that regime answer to the exposure of the SOA school in Fort Benning, Georgia, where many of the paramilitaries that massacred people in El Salvador were trained. And my question then is, because I keep hoping that this will end eventually, I think that the School of Americas is very close to being shut down, but it needs 6 votes, and now with a highly right-wing government in our country, it might not be. But you mentioned something about Colorado Springs and training going on there too. And I'm always very concerned about the lack of knowledge that my countrymen seem to have about the situations in Latin America, including my own lack of knowledge. So I was just wondering if you could address that. And again, thank you for the things that you talked about.
Yeah, that's very important. Well, the school in El Salvador, you know, it's the opposite of transparent. You know, I mean, they're doing training all the time, and they won't give out their curriculum, nothing. And there's a new, very large, I think, police academy here in San Luis Potosí that we pretty much know nothing about as well. I'm not sure if it's that same level as the one in El Salvador, but it's highly supported by the United States. In Colorado Springs, that's the Pentagon. I mean, explicitly, that's the Pentagon training. And the first thing, an AP story came out on it and said they've set up, they call them setting up their commands, you know. They've set up this Special Forces Command for Mexico, and they're taking these Mexican Armed Forces commanders up there, and they're training them in tactics from Iraq. And so this is the first time that they'd actually done that explicitly. And I went there and talked to this guy who's one of the heads of you know, the curriculum, not working directly with that command, but he's pretty high up within Northcom there, through a contact. And I said, so do you think the Mexican system the situation in Mexico is analogous to the situation of Iraq? Why are we applying this counterterrorism model in Mexico? And he said, oh, no, we don't think that. And I said, why are we applying this counterterrorism model in Mexico? And he basically couldn't answer. And he said, well, I'll get back to you on that or something. He said, no, we do not think that it's the same situation. And what's happened with that, you know, we're seeing it more and more. And that they're beginning to conflate the counter-narcotics work with counterterrorism. And I asked directly too, and I've asked a number of people, what's the international terrorist threat that's coming up from the southern border? Not one case. Not one case. You know, and they always answer, you know, they'll say, oh, we think that there's some terrorist groups in the triangle in Paraguay, you know, in this area, blah, blah. But no, there hasn't been a single threat, you know, actual concrete there. And they'll say, well, not yet. And I'll go, geez, we have so much money to spare, you know, so many lives to spare, that we're going to carry out this whole program for a threat that could materialize in the future. Not to mention the threats that we're actually facing today that are not being confronted with the least bit of effectiveness or, you know, diligence. So it's really, I think my feeling is that what's happening is that they're aware that the drug war pretext for militarization is growing thin. They have changing attitudes in the United States about prohibition and drug policy. They have a number of countries in Latin America who are saying, we really don't want to do your dirty work on this thing, and it's not our priority. And that they're trying to push it into this whole narco-terrorism and kind of, it's this pattern that we've seen throughout history of U.S. militarization, which we call exaggerated threat assessment. First, like weapons of mass production, you know, is a classic one. So you throw this threat out there, you make people afraid, very afraid, you know, and then you open the door to this militarization. So if they think that they can't proceed to the degree that they want to, just using drug cartels as the boogeyman, then they're gonna try to up it by conflating the terrorism and the drugs and beginning to, and again, pressuring toward this disastrous territorial model of territorial control, like in Iraq, as if that were what needed to be done in Mexico. And the saddest thing about it is, as they do that, they're forcing the drug cartels to respond, not exactly as terrorists, because they're just not. They don't have the political ideology. They're not looking to take over the state, but they're upping the ante. You know, the weapons are more sophisticated. It does become more a territory-based war. They become more violent. It's creating an enemy that is in fact more of a risk. Trish.
When the group from Los Libres was here, they said that Guatemala was the #1 country of infemicides. Do you know why that is, or do you agree?
Well, I think I was just with a woman from Guatemala, and I'm not sure, I can't remember the statistics exactly. But they've seen also within the last, maybe 5 years or so, this huge increase. And there's, again, it's #1 in the context of an overall increase in violence, but then we have to look at the remilitarization that's taking place in Guatemala. And the return to this military ideology, very patriarchal ideology, under Perez Molina, who is, of course, former military. And in that context, they've set up, similar to Mexico, a number of kind of government institutions to deal with the problem, but the root causes, this attitude of brute force and discrimination, I think, have contributed to it. So there's probably more specific answers as well, but I think, again, many of the reasons that we talked about from Mexico apply to Guatemala as well, with the rising overall violence and the weak institutions, the problems with the state, and having just come out of a military dictatorship, and in some ways confronting that, the sexual slavery cases that are coming up from decades ago, they're still facing kind of a new wave of something that's perhaps not quite as extreme as the sexual slavery, and the massacres of the former period, but is moving in that direction. Yes.
The new Jim Crow shed a tremendous light on the effect of the war on drugs on the young Black and Hispanic men and their jailing. Is there a comparable volume that addresses the effect of this state on women? And if there isn't, could you go home and write it?
Well, I got that on my list of to-dos, but more the international part of it, because that's the part that I work on. No, but, at least not that I know of. There might be, actually, but I've kind of looked. But what I do know is that there is an analysis, and there are very strong and wonderful women who are working on that issue in the United States, and we've made some contacts with them. And we're trying to figure out ways how to make more. When the caravan went through from Mexico, like in New York City and in Baltimore, in some of the other cities, what we found is that there are organizations that are mostly led by women, Black women in the community leaders, who are, they're working on every level. They're working on reentry, what happens to people when they go back to after incarceration. They're working on changing the policies, the drug war policies that incarcerate people, and they're working on challenging the policies and recreating their families. And they have a very deep analysis of how the drug laws have been used against their community and against their families. And the meetings between the mothers of the disappeared that went up with the caravan 2 years ago, the Mexican mothers and the mothers whose sons, 14-year-old sons, have been shot and killed as part of the drug war in their communities, say in Baltimore, they were so emotional, and they immediately recognized an affinity, a common plight and a common interest that really came from the heart even more than the shared analysis. So those connections need to be made more, but they're beginning to be made. And like I say, they're beginning to be made on a very emotional level. Yes?
Could you be more specific about who's benefiting from all of these forums that you're talking about? Like the Pentagon, like the corporations, I'm sure the oil industry has something to do with it, and other extractive
events. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a big question, but just to kind of give an overview. So the Merida Initiative has been about $2.4 billion so far, and they can't send any money to Mexico, which means that almost all of it is paid in contracts to U.S. agencies. And since the calculation in general is that 80% of State Department work is outsourced to the private sector, it's almost all going to the private sector. So what we know, it's very difficult to trace because they won't give us, the list of contracts, despite it being taxpayer money and despite filing numerous Freedom of Information Act requests for it. So we just have to get it from here and there when it comes out. It's easy to trace the big ticket items like the helicopters, a lot of helicopters, airplanes, scanning, border scanning, a lot of equipment like that. They're going to the typical Boeing, Lockheed, defense industry contractors, and then there's a lot of this training that's going to NGOs, it's going to education association, lawyers associations, in the supposed police and judicial reform. And all of these together are defending, their piece of the pie, basically. Then within Mexico, it's the beginning of, kind of making the links between places where there's conflict, disappearances, violence, and then opening up to displacement, so a process of basically generating conflict, generating violence, forcing people out of their homes and out of whole regions like in Tamaulipas, in Chihuahua, and then seeing transnational corporations come in unhindered to take over and exploit those natural resources. It's something that's been farther along and more documented in Colombia, and we're just beginning to see those kinds of links now. Because first of all, a lot of those corporations coming in will come a bit later because the privatization of the oil and gas sector, opening up to fracking, to exploitation, is just beginning. And because the documentation hasn't been done so much on it. But those will be presumably the major interests that benefit from particularly these process of displacement here. And then the specific control, like over dissidents and over certain types of populations. There's still a lot of work to be done on that in Mexico, I think, too. Yeah, back here.
Seems to me like none of this is new. The Romans did it, the coal mining companies in Virginia did it, everybody, that practice has been going for years. I want to know, and some of this sounds a lot like ISIS, like setting up military and ruthless kinds of murdering types of organizations. The world is in a bad state. I would like to know do you have a branch in Canada? Do you have an address? Do you have meetings? Do you ever go there to speak?
Yeah, sometimes. I haven't been to Canada for a while. It's in Vancouver. No, not really. I mean, we mostly just coordinate through the web page.
What is the web
Maybe it's not.
Yeah, good point. I might be able to find it, but anyway, the webpage is simple. It's www.cipamericas.org. And on the webpage, there's an address for, there's an email contact, and I think it's info@cipamericas.org. And so you can always be in touch that way. And when usually it's hard to. Like for speaking engagements, I like doing it because I get to come face to face when you're doing just the internet part of it. you don't know, you kind of throwing things out there and you're not really sure who's reading, or if it's having an impact. But in the speaking part, then I get to talk to people and see what their concerns are, and also frequently hear, yeah, this is really helpful, this, this that you're doing, and then we know what direction to go with. So I can't always respond to invitations, but welcome them, and then like kind of try to group them so that it's not like running around from here and there all the time. But other than that, yeah, I mean, we don't have like chapters or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be great to have that kind of person.
Would you repeat the website?
Sure, it's CIP Americas, altogether lowercase, .org. Bob.
I'm struck by the parallels between the establishment of NORTCOM, that's to say Mexico, being put into the defense perimeter of the Pentagon, and the Platt Amendment of 1901 that allowed the U.S. to intervene whenever it thought American lives or property were endangered in Cuba, and which was used quite a bit in the teens and 20s. I wondered if you would like to elaborate on what, for example, isn't this influx of automobile production here a sign that it's a safe place to extract profit without hiring or without any capital controls or reinvestment requirements? So,
yeah, I think they're kind of maybe two separate questions, but I think that they do consider it a good place to invest in the sense that environmental laws are not applied, and you can get away with a lot. And then the automobile is of course the best example of U.S. investment. And so what happens is, the whole sense of this expansion is that we have a lot of investment here, and we're going to protect it, even as a foreign country. And I think where we saw that this attitude. That is the same attitude as the Platt Amendment. In some ways even more clearly, it was in Colombia, because Mexico, although a lot has been lost in terms of that more nationalist attitude of national sovereignty, in terms of just national sovereignty, a lot has been lost, but they do still have the prohibition on foreign armies involved. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, Peña Nieto asked the legislature to change the law and permit U.S. agencies to carry guns in the country, because the DEA and U.S. Marshals were already doing it, and everybody knew it, and they haven't addressed that yet. But they still can't have military formally in the country. A couple of years ago, when, I don't know if you remember, but when the proposal, Hillary Clinton made the proposal to have 7 U.S. Army bases in Colombia. Some of them joint, some of them constructed separately, and it was supposed to be low profile, but the document was leaked, and there was quite a response on the part of both Colombian society and sectors of U.S. society, and it was actually blocked. But when we were looking at some of those documents, what you could see is that these 7 bases in Colombia were not just to control Colombia, where they already have significant amount of control, and this was still during the Uribe time too. But these 7 bases have the potential, from out of there, they can fly in a single flight directly to Southern Africa. And so it was creating this network just from there of global reach, now with these planes that can make these long distance flights without refueling, of global reach, almost, throughout a large part of the southern hemisphere, through the global south. And that's part of that's part of what I think they'd like to, in terms of the control of Mexico, it's more the control of the NAFTA region and Mexico itself, but it's also to have this kind of platform within the Global South.
Young lady here.
Yeah.
On a personal note, have you ever been threatened or hurt because of the years that you've been doing this for women, for men, for other countries?
No, I haven't been directly threatened. You know, I've had some weird internet things happen and that kind of thing, and we've had been developing protocols within the Women Human Rights Defenders Network that I'm a member of, so taking precautions. But no, fortunately, I haven't been directly threatened or hurt. In the kinds of, one of the most dangerous areas is to talk about the drug cartels real specifically. It's one of the things that they monitor. So a lot of time, you know, in general, I talk on the policy level anyway, but I also purposely kind of try to avoid, like, and the Gulf cartel is against the Sinaloa cartel here, and they did this, you know, the real specifics of the movements of the cartels, because that tends to be the kind of thing that they monitor. And as far as the governments, you know, Mexico City is a little safer than being in someplace like Veracruz or Tamaulipas, quite a bit safer. So that's one thing that makes it a little bit safer. And I think that it also becomes, you know, it has, as you become more well known in a sense, or especially with a base of readership in the United States, then the political cost of any type of attack becomes quite a bit higher too.
There's a hand
Oh
down
yeah,
here.
I can see the computers.
Can't see each other. Oh, okay. Just adding, she asked a question in the back about infanticide in Guatemala and Afghanistan. Infanticide is what is killing of infants.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought killing of infants, because there's a lot of that in the papers too. A lot of the femicide in Guatemala is directly probably related to drug cartels and gangs, and there's a lot of dismemberment, which is, as you said yesterday, a political message. I wanted to add something else about Guatemala, which is when Paris Molina came in.
Can't hear you.
I'm sorry, when Paris Molina came in 4 years ago, we're in an election year now, and Guatemalan presidents run for 4-year terms. He wanted to legalize drugs, and he had a dialogue going with Washington and Mexico City about everybody together decriminalizing drugs, and he was very serious about it, and this dialogue went on for, okay. Thank you. The dialogue went on between the president of Guatemala and the president of Mexico and Washington about what would be involved in decriminalizing drugs, because he was threatening at first to just have Guatemala decriminalize drugs, because drug trafficking controls so much of Guatemala's crime. And the Mexican ambassador to Guatemala got on board saying, you know, we all have to do it together. If Guatemala does it by itself, it really changes the situation totally in Mexico and the U.S. And it was something that was top of his priority list when he became president. Since I've lived in Guatemala 41 years, I've gone through 6 different elections, and since it's been a democracy, and since we've had elections that aren't just military men running, the tendency is for the president, when he comes in, it takes him 2 years to figure out how to steal, and he's learning, and the last 2 years he steals everything in sight. So right now he's in the final year. He himself isn't that corrupt, but his vice president, who's a woman, is incredibly corrupt, and she's stealing at every level, and she's got her own helicopter and basically her own army, and it's a pretty nasty situation.
But that's, no government has ever seceded itself, so everybody knows once they're out, they'll never come back. A woman journalist in Guatemala 5 years ago built a case against Alfonso Portillo, who was a president, I think he was 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And she actually was successful in photographing the bribery checks that he had received from the Embassy of Taiwan on a New York bank. And that put the ex-president of Guatemala in jail for a few years. He just got out of jail. But it was a woman journalist who risked her life. And so right now in Guatemala, there's a tremendous war on journalists. A lot of journalists are being killed, and there's a lot in the front pages of the papers about journalists risking their lives to expose corruption and drug dealings, etc. The statistic, I thought we were talking about women's deaths in Guatemala. 5,000 girls under the age of 13 have been giving birth, 10 and 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds in Guatemala. And it's now gotten to be a big issue in the newspapers because this is institutionalized incest. You know, this is all in the home, and these are all male relatives who are raping these girls. And it's getting to be a huge issue about women, and particularly young girls in homes who give birth at the age of 11 or 12 and then are returned to their family homes where they are victims of incest. And so now, one of the interesting issues in the paper is how many fathers are able to give permission for their 12-year-old and 13-year-old girls to marry older men outside of the household. But that's just a women's issue that's happening in Guatemala that I thought people would be interested in. Thank you. And thank you for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, well, you know, the only positive thing is that these things have been going on, and that they are coming to view, and people, and it's becoming an issue, at least in society. But yeah, it's really terrible. And what we were talking about, you know, not just the murder of women, but this dismemberment in these really brutal forms, is something that, of course, we're seeing more with the drug cartels as well, in the same senses that I mentioned, that they're being sent as a message to rivals, or sometimes, you know, to the women themselves, or if they believe they were informants, or there's a lot of different reasons, but it's really horrible. In a place like Ciudad Juarez, I was just talking to some people there, and the actual number of homicides has gone down because the overall, of femicides too, because the overall homicide level's gone down, because it's a case usually where the violence becomes better. You know, sometimes the government will say, we won, and there's reduction of violence there, but like in Ciudad Juarez, what generally happens is that one of the cartels wins and just takes control of the plaza, like in this case. And so there's no longer the war between the two because the other one's been driven out. And they said, yeah, well, in that context, in which homicides have gone down, there are fewer femicides, but what we're seeing is more pronounced forms of cruelty and torture. And that's another sign, like, of the cartels and of the torture, that a lot of the torture, the United States trains in torture too, and legally justifies its own torture, and then wants to go to Mexico and say, you must eradicate torture. So it's
5 minutes.
okay, yeah, Betsy.
I couldn't help but draw the analogy with the witch burning in Europe of primarily the 14th century, when hundreds of thousands of women who just didn't fit in the way women are supposed to in society, you know, women who were healers or teachers, or, you know, somehow stood out and were burned as witches. But this was also part of the devaluing of women's labor in order to facilitate the penetration of capitalist relations of production, you know, to help the capitalists, you know, build their class of workers who do not have any land. And in Mexico, we sometimes forget that there was land redistribution after the Mexican Revolution, and a lot of people in Mexico, a lot of peasants, own their own land, or they're parts, they're part of an ejido, so they have ejidal rights to land. And I would think that a lot of the violence that's going on is because of the land redistribution. It's more difficult for multinational corporations to get people off the land. But the drug wars would be a very good way of doing that. And then I was also wondering, what next month is the Organization of American States meeting in Panama? Is there any chance that something like impunity and corruption will be on the agenda there?
Yeah, on the first question, the collective ownership of land and it started in the first part of the neoliberal restructuring with the reforms to the Constitution. That means that the ejidos can have personal property, have personal title to parts of it and rent and sell. And I think that it's always been considered a major obstacle to capitalist development in Mexico, and there's always been low intensity warfare in some senses against in an offensive and a public policy offensive against those. And now women have an even greater role to play, because since in those areas there's been more out-migration by men, and they have made some advances in giving women the actual membership in the ejidos and the titles. There's a lot of places in the country where those ejidos are held primarily on a day-to-day basis by women. And I think that there will be, that the example of the witchcraft is important, because in a lot of ways what I'm trying to say is, and we all need to think it through more, because I think what's happening to us is, I anyway always feel like a couple steps behind, in terms of trying to figure out what's happening and where things are going. But that the values, the kinds of values that women tend to be closer to are exactly the knot that this stage of capitalism has to break, or the barrier that this stage of capital has to break in order to proceed the way it needs to proceed for its survival. And that was probably, as I understand it, the case with the witchcraft at the time too. People who were not just outside the system, but represented a whole series of social relations and of human values that were contrary to what was happening. And I'm not sure about the agenda.
Because we have to vacate. So on behalf of the San Rafael Committee, thank you very much, Laura.
Oh, thank you.